Namaste. On behalf of the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, INTAC, I welcome you to today's talk, How Diseases Shaped History. Diseases and epidemics have been a recurrent aspect of life on the subcontinent. However, the impact of diseases is not the same across populations or regions. Every disease affects different populations differently. Fevers have killed invaders and deterred travelers. They have affected trade, agriculture, and the state of empires. Our guest speaker today, Pranay Lal. Pranay, welcome back to INTAC and virtually this time, as the times dictate. Pranay will closely examine the role of diseases and their impact on the subcontinent's history in this talk. Pranay is a biochemist by training and works for a non-profit organization on public health. He has authored the critically acclaimed book, Indica, A Deep Natural History of the Subcontinent. Indica was the recipient of several awards across multiple literary forums, and his most recent book, Invisible Empire, The Natural History of Viruses, was published in October 21. He's also an environmental campaigner, an animator, and a caricaturist. And now, without further ado, Pranay, over to you.
Thank you, Manisha, and thank you, INTAC, for inviting me to speak about this topic, which is pretty much on everybody's minds on how diseases that have been erupting in the near future as well as in the deep past. So what has been the impact of these diseases on human history? And I think I'm going to touch upon some of these diseases and how this has impacted historical past. I'm going to share my screen, and if you could let me know if you're able to see my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is. It is. I can see the first slide.
Great. I'm just going to switch off my my camera, if that's okay, because it's going to improve the quality of the streaming. So thank you again. I just wanted to, say that, as a person who studies diseases, I look at how diseases, how potent diseases are as a force of nature. And I'm not a historian, but I'm a history buff. So for me, it is to see how diseases have had the potential of making a deep impact on society, culture, and therefore history. I'm going to start with this image of 13th December 2019, which is taken in the WHO headquarters. And this photograph is of a commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the eradication of smallpox. And to the left of this image on the hall where this picture is taken is a plaque, which is a large plaque of 3 feet by 2 feet, which commemorates the Global Commission of Certification of Smallpox Eradication in 1979. And what it actually marks is that that humans have finally been able to conquer a disease that had been affecting just about every corner of human civilization. The gentleman sitting in the center is WHO's Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, and he said that the smallpox eradication was a testimony of what we can achieve when all nations work together. When it comes to epidemic diseases, we have a shared responsibility and a shared destiny. Now, nothing could be more ironic because just 3 weeks later, there was, the whole rise of the COVID outbreak that was taking place in the city of Wuhan, and then it spread to different parts of the world. it is ironic because smallpox has plagued humanity for at least 3,000 years and killed in just the 20th century 300 million people. And this is the last and perhaps the only known human disease to be eradicated. And the last case that was reported was of smallpox, sorry, was in from Somalia in 1977. So it is very important that we keep this date in mind, that 9th December 1979, when all the uh, major doctors and epidemiologists who converged in Geneva to dedicate to the world that we are now free of smallpox. And that on 13th December 2019, the WHO again converges 40 years later to celebrate that moment. But it could be a tragic comic moment for many of us, because we know what happened subsequently in Wuhan and thereafter the rest of the world. Now, COVID-19 has shown to us that how powerful it is as a disease. What it has done is that it has made countries less democratic. It has given more power to governments. Governments have become more autocratic. There have been significant changes in terms of geopolitics because of the pandemic and its aftermath. I'm not going to be discussing that because that's a part of ongoing history. But what we know is that diseases, it reaffirms the belief that diseases are a potent force, but they seldom find a mention in terms of how epidemics and outbreaks have shaped the course of human history, in particular, the history in the Indian subcontinent. Uh, so while historians have been writing on India and South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, they have emphasized on usually what is the post 1500 European sources, which have been largely quoted, or what the European travelers have noticed in India, whether it's in terms of epidemics of humans or of crops or even animals. But there is very little in terms of a comprehensive understanding of what was the nature or the impact of these epidemics. Now, for example, David Arnold's pioneering essay, The Indian Ocean as a Disease Zone, 1500 to 1950, for example, has relied largely on narratives that are constructed of European accounts. It just does not bring forth that larger picture of what were the impacts of these epidemics on the populations and the empires and the kingdoms that were affected by these massive outbreaks of diseases. So over the past 2 decades, there have been developments in molecular genetics and also the nature in which biologists, epidemiologists, and disease historians have been studying pathogenic organisms. And they now understand more deeply and in much more granular way how malaria and tuberculosis and leprosy and smallpox and plague and cholera and all these diseases have emerged in different parts of the world, in particular South Asia, and how these have been critical in terms of affecting new populations and thereby causing chaos and major disruption in trade and governance of empires. Now, the most revolutionary aspect of this new historical epidemiology is that these both draw on narratives of biology as well as documentary sources, which have been traditionally used by historians to move forward a new agenda of writing history, or at least understanding history in a more granular way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on three major diseases, which I talk about in my most recent book, Invisible Empire. And I will take you through a short journey of what could have been possibly the impact of these diseases on human life in the past in India. So let's start with smallpox, because we're still at smallpox. So I'm going to stay with smallpox for a moment and bring you to understand what smallpox could have done to human society. Let's start with this image. This is a this is a caricature of from an 1880 magazine, a French magazine for women, and it shows a photograph, rather a drawing, etching of three children with a spotty fever or an infection. Now, what this drawing is trying to show is that these are three entirely different diseases. The one on the left is smallpox. It gives very large blisters on the exterior of the skin, often leading to disfigurement and sometimes even blindness. This is a viral disease. The one in the center is scarlet fever. You have very, very tiny treacle-like uh, blisters that emerge on the skin, which completely vanish once the fever passes. And it actually does not have a very high kill rate compared to smallpox. And the uh, uh, the third infectious disease is rubella, which also is a disease that causes small blisters, but it's again not something very serious. It's again a viral disease. So till 1880, we did not even know what a virus, or even the understanding of what bacteria and other infectious agents was not known to Western sciences. So what I'm trying to drive here is that our understanding of the nature of disease and its spread and its origins is something which is so recent that we don't fully understand on how these diseases emerge or spread and how they have had an impact on human society. Uh, for those of us who study human history, or at least history of the Indian subcontinent, there is a dearth of drawings that show things that are in bad light. For example, we don't show famine, we don't show disease and epidemics, or scenes that are macabre. And such drawings, for example, are only seen in Chinese, Japanese, or Western European art, because uh, such art, I mean, for various reasons which I'm not fully aware of, uh, are absent in the Indian art forms. I just wanted to show you that different cultures have known that smallpox has existed and affected them, and they are worshipped and venerated and feared. And these gods and goddesses are invoked at various times. In China, for example, this painting on the top left is of Pan Chen, who is both a male and a female deity, which is invoked to protect communities and societies from the prakop, or the anger that such fevers would bring upon the people. On the top left is a textured Japanese watercolor, which shows smallpox. It's the broad rashes that happen in an advanced stage of smallpox. On the bottom left is an Aztec mask from 1630. Now, we know that smallpox was introduced in South America by the Spanish invaders, the conquistadors. And these masks became uh, relatively commonplace in South America, with these pustules, or these small boil-like protrusions on the face of a person who is actually has pallid eyes and teeth which are exposed, which is a sign of death, a grimace which is very deathly. And on the bottom right is the West African god called Sopona. And this was a common uh, item that was taken by the slaves from West Africa to Brazil, or to the other places where they were being transported, because they wanted protection of their native god, Sapona, if they went into new places, especially smallpox. And notice again, there are these blue and white uh, spots that are there on the god called Sapona. But in India, we have known that Sitla Mata, who's largely deity whose popularity grew in North and Northwestern India and Central India around the late 15th and early 16th century. But before that, there were two other goddesses, Hariti and Jyeshtha. Both of them were protectors of families, and they ensured that families and communities that worshipped Hariti and Jyeshtha ensured that their worship would bring protection to families and their children in particular. To the right is Mariamma, which is an extremely famous goddess, usually in the east-facing, facade of a Gopupuram of temples, of South Indian temples. You see them quite commonly in Tamil Nadu and Kerala and Andhra Pradesh and southeastern Karnataka. This picture is from Singapore, where the 1834 temple, which was made by the Tamilian emigre to these countries that they went to, whether it was in Fiji or Singapore or Mauritius, you find the statue of Mariamma. Now, I just want to delve a little longer on smallpox here, because I just want to show you this image of Pandit Tudu, who is a very famous character of miniature art in the late 17th century. And he's shown in very many different phases of life. He could act as a barber or a milkman. But here he's he's a person, he's a Brahmin who is inoculating his wife, and you see a needle in his hand, and he's got a small ink pot like container in his left hand, and he's got other scalpel like blades in his other hand as well. So Pandit Tudu was known to be a famous character who denotes the inoculation process that was known to at least to the Brahmins and the Barber community in much of India, which is an evidence that there was a very significant amount of inoculation, at least that was available, or at least known to many communities in India. Now, while the British had brought scientific vaccination to India between 1790 and 1800s, there was this attempt to get cowpox from the cow lymph into India. And that was a story that is an incredible story of how a relay of couriers was made by using children as carriers of the cowpox in their bloodstream. I'm not going to tell you that story because that's there in my book, and I hope you get a chance to read that, because it has an extremely interesting episode of how Napoleon Bonaparte, who was, on his campaigns in Europe, was disrupting that chain. But what I want to actually talk about is that in a historic sea journey that happened from Europe to the port of Bombay, and when a courier of children from Europe arrived on 14th of June 1802, the first person in India to be inoculated was a Eurasian girl who was vaccinated in Bombay. Now, children of mixed race or British children from orphanages were used as live couriers of the cowpox, and they were sent to Pune and Surat and Hyderabad and Ceylon, Madras and Bengal to begin vaccination in cantonments and British settlements. By 1820, the practice of inoculating using cow lymph, or cowpox lymph rather, had spread to the rest of the subcontinent, and vaccination was available to Indians, especially those who worked very closely with the British. And the vaccination campaigns helped the British Indian government to directly impinge upon the lives of ordinary Indians. The second image that I want you to draw attention to is how the British manufactured myths to tell the people that there is so much acceptance of smallpox inoculation even in Indian history. And this is a story of Francis White Ellis, a British administrator and scholar of South Indian languages, especially Tamil. And what he did was he smuggled a Tamil verse in this document, which he then placed in an archive, and he called it the legend of the cowpox. And it is written in the style of the Puranas. It consists of a discussion between a physician and the god Dhanvantri and the feminine force called Shakti. Now, the three of them are discussing how cows have been protectors of human life and that they can relieve human suffering, especially from smallpox. Now, what Ellis did was he passed off his handwritten text as something as being part of an ancient text and made priests and Tamil scholars of the time in the early 1800s to believe that this is something which is ancient. And what this is what the Indologists and historians, especially Tamil literature historians, call it the pious fraud. That means this is a sacred fraud that was created or it was smuggled into Indian text. And to make the whole process very popular among people and the masses, there were uh, there were kings and princesses and the royalty that was recruited. Now, the image that you see on the right is a painting by Thomas Hickey, and it's a portrait of three princesses from Mysore who became the champions. They came out of the court of Mysore and publicly got themselves inoculated and said that, we are going to take the shot. We want you to take the jab of cowpox to protect yourself from smallpox. Now, so the history of smallpox in India has been that of continuous waves that developed in the 15th century, and every 40 years, there have been massive waves of smallpox that happened across different parts of India. And that's the reason why we have chalisas, because different communities, venerate and read out these chalisas, because there were 40 verses that were that denoted 1 year of protection when they had from a certain god or a goddess. So you have Hanuman Chalisa, Durga Chalisa. All those chalisas came into exist because of the 40-year cycle of the epidemics. I just want to now take you to these gory images. And I'm sorry I'm showing this to you, but this is really, really important. The image on the top left is feet and hands of a child from the National Museum in Prague. And this is conserved or preserved in a jar of formalin from 1650. Discoveries of near intact bodies with skin and bones and even teeth are something that are very helpful. So the Lithuanian crypt with this child and this ancient mummified remain of Ramesses V and this Viking grave from 600 years in Common Era are all something that have informed us about how the smallpox has evolved. Now, what we know is that smallpox actually has evolved more recently than we had imagined. The French and the British who had discovered the mummies with smallpox-like scabs are now considered to be that to have got and died because of smallpox. Well, the DNA that we are getting from these different crypts and other sources suggests that the virus that crossed over into humans about 3,000, 4,000 years ago did not become a potent force until about 600 in the Common Era. So what has therefore been killing people before that in what looked like smallpox was perhaps another different disease. So what this clearly shows is that although the virus has been known historically, there might have been other viruses that perhaps acted similar to that of smallpox and have been causing diseases which look similar, but perhaps were not smallpox itself. So we don't know what killed Ramesses V or Ramesses IV, for example. But what we now know is that this child in Prague, or this Lithuanian child in the crypt, or this Viking, died from smallpox variants that were entirely different. Tragically, we've not been able to find DNA or any remains from Indian uh, bones or skeletal remains as yet. And if that were to happen, it would really, really inform how the epidemic and what strain and what kind of virulence it had. So, this is a story of a disease that we've eradicated, but we frankly did not know enough about the virus that actually cause the death and the disease. I'm now going to move to plague because the plague is an incredible disease and it has had a major impact on Western European and especially in the British history. But I'm also going to talk about another disease that happened in parallel, which has got discovered very recently. There's actually a body of art from ranging from all across Europe, which actually shows amazing insights into how the society reacted to uh, the various waves of plagues that took place in Europe. But what is incredible is that there is very little that that is available to us in terms of what happens when the plague epidemic occurred in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the first major confirmed wave of the plague took place between 1347 and 1352 in Western Europe, Central and Western Europe. Uh, the original notion was that it started in China and moved along the Silk Route and reached Europe. But it is now confirmed that it started somewhere along the banks of the river Volga in central Russia, and it migrated east uh, to China and also migrated west or traveled west into Europe, thereby creating a single uniform corridor starting from the Volga. So it's been now been corrected that and that myth has been dispelled that China was the main exporter of the bacteria called Yersinia pestis into Europe. The second major wave that took place was from 1623 to 1632. Those 9 years were devastating for Central and Western Europe and Italy and Spain in particular. But one thing that again emerged here is that the epidemic, the outbreak, the foci of the infection was again not Europe, but somewhere around Kazakhstan and Russia, and that area in the central region of the Urals and the Caucasus Mountains. So there's been only one clear evidence from this time that shows that there was an impact on India as well. The city of Agra, which was perhaps one of the major cities of the world at this time in 1616, was devastated by the arrival of the first wave of the plague to Agra. Now, Agra rivaled Venice and Peking as among the most powerful cities of the world. Delhi and Jaipur then became, after this devastated epidemic, Agra lost its prominence, and it was Delhi that became the largest North Indian city, followed by Jaipur, which became the hub for gems trade and other trades. And Agra lost its position as being the most prominent city in India, especially in North India. So, and soon after this, there was another episode that coincided with the waning of what was happening in Europe. And it was the third global pandemic, which was in 1647 and 1657. And the impact was largely felt in Greece and Italy and Spain and North Africa. But again, two Indian cities which were trading extensively with Europe, largely from the East Coast and the West Coast, from Surat and Machilipatnam. Both these cities of Firozabad and Bijapur were badly affected. And the cities became ghost towns overnight, and Bijapur and Firozabad became so prone to attacks, especially by the Marathas, who were attacking the Deccan cities at the time, and they lost their powerful position of holding the Deccan together. So both Firozabad and Bijapur lost their prominent positions in history after 1652. Uh, However, the first or the first confirmed case of plague epidemic in India comes again from trade and travelers from Hong Kong. But this is much, much later in 1894 when a massive episode of plague took place, and about 180,000 people died in Hong Kong in the first year. And when it reached India in 1896, there were 12.5 million deaths in central India, and especially in the cotton belt of India, and also the places where millets were stored. And India, again, perhaps saw its first major epidemic of any disease in recorded history. And the British have kept a very, very good record of these 12.5 million deaths that occurred in India over three years. So from 1896 to 1899, there was massive losses in terms of life and also economic losses to the people of India. But this is only one part of the story. I was going to tell you about another ague or another fever that happened or occurred concomitantly along with the plague. And this is something which is called the English sweating sickness. As the name suggests, it is causes profuse sweating, and it causes people who contract this fever to become extremely lethargic, and eventually they're not able to even feed themselves, get out of bed, and they die because of lack of nourishment and energy. Now, there was along this time a disease which occurred along with the plague, which is the English sweating disease or sweating sickness, which was confusing because it occurred in parallel or separately along these periods when the Black Death or the plagues were taking place in Europe. And they were, again, an incredible amount of art that shows that there was perhaps another fever, but they had not named it as such. I just want to uh, bring to your focus on the image on the left. And if you notice, the the caretaker on the bottom left who's seated is wiping her brow and she is sweating. Even the caretaker on the right is sweating and wiping her brow and her forehead. There's a physician in the center who's holding a flask and looking at what is perhaps a sample of urine of the patient who is in the bed. Now, what this fever did was it caused the urine to turn dark brown, and this was a symptom that actually showed that there was a fever about which we now know what it was. This fever, which in Latinized form is known as sudor anglicus or the English sweating disease, was not restricted. Although it started in England, it migrated to France and to Holland and to the rest of Europe, and it came in several waves. In fact, one of its most important uh, victims was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and I was able to get a copy of Mozart's death certificate, and the death certificate reads that he died of high fever and kidney failure, and perhaps Mozart also had the same brown urine that developed in the classic cases of people who developed or contracted English sweating disease. Now, just want to tell you that, like plague, which is caused by a rat and which a flea transmits, but it is caused by a bacteria, a mouse-like creature called a bank vole, found all across Europe, is the carrier of this virus called the Hanta virus. Now, Hanta is actually a place it's a river in Korea. So this is a virus that we know causes this disease called the sweating sickness. And so what we now understand that the plague was not a standalone single disease. There might have been multiple epidemics of other pathogens, other disease-causing agents that occurred simultaneously. And therefore, the period between 1300s and early 1600s for Western Europe and England were mired with these very, very significant fevers. I'm going to move to malaria, and malaria is a disease, as most of us know, is largely prevalent in India and has been widely studied. It's a disease spread by mosquitoes, and it's caused by an organism called Plasmodium. There are five species of Plasmodium, but the most important Plasmodium is the one that causes the most lethal form of malaria, which is called Plasmodium falciparum. And there are specific mosquitoes called Anopheles and a few culex that can carry the Plasmodium in their gut, and they take it from one human victim to another. Now, before the arrival of pesticides like DDT, there were about 100 million deaths taking place every decade from malaria. Uh, and Europe was one of those places where we had significant numbers of people dying from malaria. The earliest records of malaria come from the Middle Ages, which is about 476 to 1492 AD in Europe. Now, the driver for malaria is climatic and environmental variations that occur over periods of warming and mild cooling. It's the kind of weather that we notice in the Eastern Ghats or South Central India, and of course, Northeast India, where it's slightly cooler but humid environment that makes it possible. Now, this is the period when the Earth was starting to lose its warmth and started to cool a little. And this was the period when northern France, Germany, Italy, and England had severe bouts of malaria. Now, malaria, although is usually considered to be living in marshes and swamps and wetlands, it's also found in lower hills because that's where the malarial mosquito tends to thrive. In the modern era of Europe, we know that malaria became persistent in South and Northwestern malaria, especially in places like Paris. There is a recent study, again, from the dead remains of people buried in the catacombs of Paris. And what has been found, and it's been reported in the Royal Society of Medicine, and they studied 820 bodies of malaria, and they found in those bodies, 230 of them had malaria. And most of them would have died because of the malarial fever, because it was the most infective and the most virulent form of malaria that was discovered in their tissues. Now, I won't want to hazard too much of what has been the impact of malaria in the Indian subcontinent, but if I were to draw a line from the city of Gaur, which is now in Bangladesh, and you draw a line westwards towards Jabalpur and then bring it down to north of Masalipatnam in the North Arcot, in the Krishna district, you would notice that that crescent, that curved, a knife-shaped, or rather a boomerang-shaped landmass, is an area where the Mughals did not have real control. In fact, there were no large empires, except the Vakatakas, who controlled till the 14th century parts of central Chhattisgarh. There are really no large empires that actually occurred here, because congregations of large cities in ancient times in this region was not possible, because malaria would have had a devastating impact on these populations if they lived in large congregations. So malaria, what it does, like you see in West Africa and other parts of Southeast Asia, you do not have historically very large cities, because malaria tends to thrive and spread faster in cities which have very large concentrated populations. And that's one evidence that we see from parts of northeastern India and this swathe of land that I just described you, east of Gaur and north of the North Arcot district. So clearly, malaria is something that is incredibly important in terms of how it has shaped the fate of the Indian empire and sorry, the Indian subcontinent and empires that existed historically, like the Kalinga and the Kharavela and the others, perhaps were were imposed by this impact of malaria, because as malaria waxed and waned, populations decreased, and they had to disperse themselves and live in smaller populations that caused this. Now, I want to bring notice to this image, again, a slightly ghastly image of skulls. Now, what this is trying to show you is that the modern discoveries that we are making of skeletal remains from the late Harappan period, they are providing some incredible insights of how death occurred in the late Bronze period or the middle to late Harappan period. And skulls, and we've not found enough DNA to actually get into greater analysis. But since the mid 80s, there have been very interesting research, especially done by the Deccan College and others, which have been showing this. Now, I want to talk about the image on the left. Now, this is a classic case of a metabolic disorder that is seen in skeletons of people who suffer from anemia, and they develop these microscopic lesions that are become porous. Now, for several decades, researchers considered these lesions on the cranial vault, this curved part of our head, which is of the skull. It's called the porotic hyperostosis. And the orbital roof, the image on the right that you see, if you notice the eye sockets, there are these spongy tissues that you see at the top of the eyeball, either eye socket rather. And what this is called is cribra orbitalia. Now, these are symptoms which was signs of chronic iron deficiency and anemia that starts in the early childhood but persist during adulthood. And this is a typical thing that we see in people who suffer from scurvy or malaria or even chronic tuberculosis or other infectious diseases. So we've had about 18 to 25% of all skeletons that have been found in the Indus Valley cities, whether it's Rakhigari or Damdama or so many of these cities that have burials, and even the ones found in Pakistan and Afghanistan. It suggests that there is perhaps not genetic, but an induced anemia caused by a fever, a persistent fever that caused these conditions and therefore early death. Dr. Robin Skugg and her colleagues have found that these skeletals evidence could also be a complex interaction between anemia caused by malaria, but also a secondary infection of leprosy and tuberculosis, which therefore suggests that there was a sequence of infections that caused the decline of the Harappan society. But what about animal and plant diseases? Now, I'm now going to come closer to the close of my talk. India has been home to several animal diseases, and in particular, rinderpest. This is a disease that affects hooved animals, and you notice this image from 1951, where entire village populations of buffaloes got decimated. There was one estimate that says that at any given time in India, in any given year rather, there are about 10 million cows or buffaloes that die from rinderpest. And they occur in focal areas. If you have large congregations of buffaloes or cows and rinderpest were to strike, it would make sure that the entire populations of cows and buffaloes would die. And that would push farmers and the farming communities or villagers to abject poverty. The other two diseases are also still very common, and they are wheat rust and the brown spot disease of rice. These are diseases that occur once the grain has matured and it's come on the on the on the on the wheat or the or rice. It has flowered, and yet what happens is that they become completely inedible. And this kind of devastation is something that has been known for a very long time. In fact, the first big famines that occurred post independence in India, 1951, Kerala, Tamil Nadu and Kerala had a massive rice epidemic, a rice disease that occurred, which caused Kerala to seek support from the center to sustain its food supplies because it had no rice growing that year. The same thing happened in central provinces when in 1953-54 and again in 1971 and 72, wheat rust decimated uh, the wheat, the young wheat crop in Malwa, in Madhya Pradesh, and Haryana and Punjab. And we had, for the first time, had to import a massive amount of wheat to sustain supplies and prevent episodes of hunger in India from Australia and America. So it's not just human diseases, but also diseases of animals and plants that also impact society and empires. So I'm just going to not take any more time and I'm just going to summarize what I have talked about. And for me, diseases are extremely dynamic and they occur in cycles. They cause death and mayhem, but what they also do is they alter populations and population structures because they selectively kill uh, more men than women in some cases, or more women than men of certain ages and of certain kinds. In case of malaria, for example, young women and especially pregnant women are the ones who are most affected, followed by children. So therefore, the population structures can go completely haywire. Animal and plant disease, like I mentioned in my previous slide, seldom find any mention in how they have shaped history because they cause massive amount of hunger and devastation. So it is therefore, to my mind, a very important factor that we look at disease and climate variability and a lot of other forces of nature while we understand the context and the settings of any historical episodes of the past, because we have, it's rather convenient for us to say that a certain empire rose to power and then vanished and another empire took over. There are settings, there are contexts, there are other factors that decide the fate of how powerful empires fell and new empires arose. And those contexts need to be understood in terms of very many new variables that scientists are trying to tell us about deep past. Thank you so much. And for those of you who have not read my book, much of this is discussed in my current book, where I talk about how viruses in particular, but also other microbes, are not only essential for our survival, but also a major force in how they shape life and death of human beings and all creatures. Thank you so much. Over to you, Manisha.
Thank you, Pranay. I'm still processing a lot of what you've said. It's a lot to process, very intriguing, very interesting, and uh, a new insight. One always knew that, nature and culture and how they are correlated, interdependent, but this is something which requires probably more research and more, for documentation, not only for archival purposes, but also to draw lessons. Now, I want to ask you one question before, I let you go. And that is that um, we clearly have not learned our lessons because pandemics have, been devastating, continue to be devastating despite the advances that science has made. I mean, COVID-19 pandemic has killed millions today. I want to know that, the diseases or the viruses that we've been able to eradicate, is there a chance of their resurfacing? Can we bring them back with our whatever we are not doing right, in treating the environment?
Right. Thank you. That's a great question. So the only human disease we've been able to eradicate is smallpox. And the good thing about smallpox was that humans were the only reservoir of the disease. And therefore, eradication was possible. Um, there, I mean, it is given the sophisticated nature in which we now are able to use genomics and bioengineering, it is very simple for anyone to actually reconstruct a smallpox virus. And it has already been done, just as a gag. Scientists in Canada mail ordered, genes and different proteins, and they were able to concoct a smallpox. So, that's the danger of the fact that science can be reverse engineered, and you can reconstruct a virus. So while we have eradicated it in the wild because no human contains that virus, there are repositories. Russia has a repository, and America, they keep both of these keep repositories of smallpox. So there's a danger that if it falls in the wrong hands, smallpox can again be used as a tool of bioterror. The only other disease that has been eradicated in animals is rinderpest, the image that I showed you. It was a relatively simple disease to eradicate. It is from the family of measles. We can eradicate measles and polio, but the international community has not come together and coordinated to eradicate so many other viral diseases that can be eradicated. But here's the word of caution. When you eradicate a virus uh, from nature, there are other viruses from the related families that are willing to take its place. So I talk about this cautionary tale in my book in the smallpox chapter, and I actually it's rather weird that I actually mention monkeypox and camelpox and buffalo pox. Now these are pox viruses that are very similar to smallpox, and I have uh, perhaps jinx the whole process by saying that there will be a revival of these pox viruses because they have already started to cross over into human beings. So therefore, it is eradication is a good thing, but we have to keep a surveillance on for all new diseases, especially things like monkeypox. I think we're kind of late on it, but it's still good to have a guard up on that. We've got buffalo pox, which is a very, very important and a virulent pox virus that is found in central Maharashtra. We had a big episode in the 1970s. We have these cases every 5 or 6 years, and we have to keep our eyes open and surveillance and guards up to make sure that these viruses don't emerge. And if they do, we are able to quarantine and isolate and cure these episodes that occur in humans.
Well, I continue to process. And well, we are nearly, the time is up. And thank you very much, Pranay, not only for this very, very insightful talk, but making time for this talk at a very short notice. Um, we hope to get you back soon again, and looking forward to your third book, which is on how diseases shape history. So thank you very much.